In 1888, a politician requested a ride from a carriage to go from his Wall Street law office to his home on 29th Street. When the driver asked for $50 for that ride, the politician decided it would be better to walk instead. And that walk was the worst decision of his life. This video comes as a request from Jag3821. I thank you for submitting this story request. Without further ado, let's get into today's story. Elias Dunn was a weatherman who was often called Farmer Dunn because the country's forecasting service had just been transferred to the Department of Agriculture. The date was Saturday, March 10th, 1888. Walt Whitman had just written a poem for the New York Herald about the first flower of spring. This had been the mildest winter in 17 years. The Weather Bureau reported from the 5th floor of the Equitable Life Building, which stood at 120 Broadway, a block north of Wall Street. A building of the same name was actually built there again in 1915. Now, the way the weather was reported back then, you had weather observers that were stationed all up and down the East Coast, and they would relay information to the Coast Guard via telegraph or carrier pigeon. And this was a time when telephone and telegraph wires freely hung over the streets and sidewalks of New York. So Farmer Dunn would call up New York's Coast Guard headquarters on the Lower East Side, get the reports, and draw up a forecast for the papers. Now, based on the information he received from the Coast Guard, Farmer Dunn's report for Sunday was that it would be cloudy, followed by light rain, and then the rain would clear. There was nothing unusual happening in other cities. This very much seemed like any normal day of weather reporting. Then, Farmer Dunn took the elevator down to the lobby, exited out of the Equitable Life Building, and began his trip home to Brooklyn. He wouldn't have to worry about the weather again until Monday, as Sunday was his day off. The next day, so Sunday, it seemed relatively warm by noon. The temperature rose to 40 degrees Fahrenheit, even though the sun hadn't come out, and New Yorkers began to air out their homes. All of this winter air that was trapped in their home could be refreshed by spring air making its way through the city. They'd open their windows and they would leave for church. And when the afternoon came, light rain started to fall as predicted by Farmer Dunn. But after a short while, the light rain started to become thicker and it developed into a downpour. And the temperature started to drop at a very rapid rate. Anyone who had left their windows open for the day may have even come home to a semi-flooded home. This rain muddied the streets, which slowed all of the horse-drawn streetcars, and even the 4 elevated train lines in the city were delayed. What New York did not know was that the rain in Washington and Baltimore had morphed into sleet, and ice had begun to freeze the telephone and telegraph wires. This was the result of a second storm coming from the northwest. So these two storms converging on one another were about to create the perfect storm. Farmer Dunn observed the weather becoming bitterly cold, and he feared that he made a poor weather forecast, so he wanted to go revise his reports. But that would require him to go into the office, which again is in Manhattan, and he lives in Brooklyn. Also remember, this is his day off. He doesn't have to do anything. But Farmer Dunn knew that this was the right thing to do, so he grabbed his coat and he ventured out into the storm, which was changing to an ice storm. He reached his office by 5 p.m. At this point, Dunn's assistants had put out a forecast for Monday, which was simply fair and warmer. Farmer Dunn did not feel good about this weather forecast, though, while looking out the window, and figured that he would try to communicate with other cities about what their weather was. He attempted to telegraph Washington headquarters, but there was no response there. So he tried the telephone, but again, no luck. He had no idea that their wires had frozen over. He was able to reach his own Coast Guard, but they told him that they hadn't heard from anybody for hours. So Dunn, using intuition, revised his weather forecast predicting a cold wave to hit New York. A little after midnight, the sleet and ice turned into dry snow, and by dawn on Monday, March 12th, there were snowdrifts growing in size all over the city. The wind speed had increased to 75 miles per hour, and this snowstorm was now showcasing hurricane-like qualities. By 5 a.m., railway service came to a halt, and no ship entered or departed from the greatest port in the world. Meanwhile, Roscoe Conkling, a former congressman and U.S. senator, was leaving his home on 29th Street to go down to his law office on Wall Street. A report was coming from Buffalo that Conkling should even think about running for president of the United States. Conkling had butted heads with President Garfield in 1880, though, and he resigned from the Senate and found it difficult to get back into politics afterwards. So he began a law career and had found himself there ever since. For some people, it doesn't matter what the weather is, work needs to be done, so Conkling finds some method of transportation likely a carriage, and he gets down to his law office on Wall Street. We'll get back to him a little bit later. By 7 a.m., temperatures have dropped to 21 degrees Fahrenheit. Don't forget, the temperature was 40 degrees less than 24 hours earlier. Less than 4% of the New York Stock Exchange's 600 members were on the trading floor when the opening gong rang. Another 3% of the 1,200 people working for the American banknote company showed up for work. This was a devastating day of work for businesses. In fact, many department stores had advertised that this was a spring sale day. For B. Altman & Company, one of the most popular stores in town, all they were able to say for their spring sale was they sold a single spool of thread all day. That was the only transaction. Funny enough, a department store downtown called E. Ridley & Company had just purchased 3,000 unclaimed snow shovels at the end of the season at a bargain price of $1,200. So they began selling them for $1 each, making a nice quick $1,800 profit. Today, that $1,800 is equivalent to about $58,000 from selling snow shovels. The snowfall itself was about 18 inches for the day, but because these winds were so powerful, drifts rose to 30 feet in some places. People downtown were unable to see the fence going around St. Paul's Chapel. First-floor residents in any home, hotel, business had a very high probability of looking out the window and only seeing bright white. The Brooklyn Bridge was too dangerous to cross, and so Brooklyn and Manhattan were cut off from one another. And then you have all of these trains that have come to a halt. When these elevated trains were first created, a perk that was promised was that bad weather would never affect the train's ability to continue its operations. But these 4 elevated train lines were stuck. A total of 15,000 people were stranded high above the streets. The winds attacked these train cars so violently that many passengers feared the trains would topple off of the tracks and crash onto the streets down below. Along the sides of the train, there was this icy, narrow path that several passengers did attempt to walk down in order to get to the nearest station, but this was full exposure to the hurricane-like element, so it was incredibly dangerous. The fire department attempted to reach these trains, but had a lot of difficulty traveling through the snow as well. However, there were nearby households with ladders at their disposal who saw a business opportunity and would begin propping them up against the tracks or sides of the buildings to invite stranded passengers down, but at the cost of anywhere between 5 cents and $1, which today would be equivalent to anywhere between like $1.60 and $32. Unfortunately, there was one train that could not be reached by any ladders, and the 30 passengers were left stranded for approximately 15 hours. The only thing they had going for them was they had access to a length of cord that could reach the bar directly underneath them. It wasn't the strongest cord in the world, but it was able to lift the weight of buckets of booze, which the bar graciously passed along to those passengers. The conditions of several buildings were impacted in such a way that windows smashed, roof shingles and gutters were ripped from the sides of the buildings, and the wind carried these things through the air, crashing into men, women, children. People were taken to the hospital with bruises, cuts, gashes, broken limbs, frostbite. Any buildings that had room to protect people who were outside opened up for such. This included hotels, armories, police stations, saloons, billiard halls. The city really came together to help one another, although many did so for a profit if they could. Now let's get back to Roscoe Conkling. Roscoe Conkling was at his law office from the early hours of the morning until 1 in the afternoon, and still, not a single client showed up. Being that this seemed like a total waste of time, by 1:30, Conkling said, you know what, it's time to go home. So his plan was to actually go to the New York Club at 5th Avenue and 25th Street, which was just a few blocks from his house. In a straight trip, that's about a 3-mile journey. So he headed to Broadway, hoping to find a cab or carriage willing to take him uptown. And as he's waiting for one, he's watching all of this snow and ice pouring off of the roof of Trinity Church into their graveyard. He was able to find a carriage, so he flagged it down. And when the driver asked him where he wanted to go, Conkling told him the New York Club, and the driver wanted $50 for that ride. This is the equivalent of asking for $1,600 for a 3-mile ride today, which nearly every person in New York would refuse to pay. But this was a supply and demand kind of situation. There weren't that many carriages out today. Horses were even being fed whiskey just to keep them from freezing. Still, Conkling decided this price was far too outrageous and decided to start walking north and see if somebody would find him along the way to pick him up. He trudged up Broadway past City Hall. No luck. He looked east to what should have been an empty Brooklyn Bridge, but instead it was just a white cloud of nothing, and there was something just so eerie about that. The wind howled and whistled around him. All he wanted was a hot cup of tea. He was freezing. Now, every so often, he'd see another person crazy enough to be battling the elements. That included a police officer who was dragging fainted girls from City Hall Park into a nearby hotel in an attempt to warm them up. But this was a truly impossible time to make out anything he was seeing. Even when walking into a public square, it was impossible to tell where the borders of the square began and ended. The snowdrifts were too high, and the air was too clouded to make out anything unless you were right next to it. By 2:45 p.m., the wind peaked at 84 miles per hour, and the temperature was 10 degrees Fahrenheit. By the time Conkling reached Union Square, which was about 2.5 miles from where his law office was, he was so exhausted that he nearly collapsed. He continued wiping snow from his eyes, although he was covered with ice and packed snow. The renowned banker J.P. Morgan made a very similar trip to Conkling, although being one of the wealthiest men in America, did pay his cab to wait for him when he left his own Wall Street office to head home. The cab had to give up a block short of Morgan's home, and after walking only a block to get to his home, J.P. Morgan collapsed onto his own floor, and a servant had to pull him inside. So that should give you an idea as to how brutal these conditions were that Conkling was walking through. And after about 3 hours after he began his journey through the snow, Conkling finally arrived at the New York Club. Now, on a clear day with good weather and a good pair of shoes, this walk should take just about an hour. Instead, this walk took Roscoe Conkling approximately 3 hours. And when he stepped into the New York Club, he made no attempt to talk to anybody. He just crashed to the floor. Those inside helped to warm him up, but he was in poor condition. 2/3 of the electric light poles in Manhattan had been blown down, while nearly all of them in Brooklyn were down. Gas street lamps were useless as the frost had shut off the gas supply, and by 10 p.m. the temperature dropped to 6 degrees Fahrenheit. This was bad news for all of the tenement dwellers throughout the city. People slept on top of one another to keep warm as best as they could. 5 new plays were scheduled to open that Monday night, but none of them did. A few shows did end up running as scheduled that evening, though, one with a surprisingly large audience, but most plays were just a total inconvenience to the actors on stage. P.T. Barnum refused to cancel his greatest show on earth despite less than 200 spectators. By 6 a.m. the following morning, March 13th, the snow had stopped falling. The temperature was 1 degree below zero. The exact number of deaths caused by the storm is unknown, although it's believed to be over 400 people. Electricity, telephone, and telegraph cables were moved underground as a result of the storm because of how badly they were a safety hazard, and property damage totaled somewhere between $20 million and $25 million, which today would be equivalent to about $810 million. And as for Roscoe Conkling, in the weeks that followed, he contracted pneumonia, which is a lung disease, and mastoiditis, which is an infection of air cells in the skull behind your ear. This happened as a direct result of him walking home instead of paying a greedy cab driver. He had a surgical procedure done to try to remedy his infection, but it progressed to meningitis. Today, with proper treatment, meningitis still kills 3 in every 20 people. In 1888, the rate was much higher, and about a month after this massive blizzard, Roscoe Conkling died on April 18, 1888. He was 58 years old. So that's going to do it, folks. The blizzard of 1888 affected not just New York, but 10 to 58 inches of snow fell in parts of New Jersey, Massachusetts, Rhode Island, and Connecticut as well. This storm is actually the reason we moved a lot of things underground, not just wires, but trains as well. The first underground subway trains opened in Boston just 9 years later, and then New York wasn't too far behind them on that. The New York Stock Exchange was closed for 2 days, which didn't happen again until Superstorm Sandy crippled us in 2012. There's plenty more information out there on this storm that I encourage you to check out on your own. If you enjoyed today's story, please make sure you leave a like and a comment. Make sure to subscribe to the channel as well so you don't miss any of my weekly uploads. It felt really silly to film this during the summertime, but you got to give the people what they want, right? So shout out once again to Jag3821 for the story suggestion. And until next time, deuces, kids.